Hello, hello. Welcome to part two of Developer Essentials. My name is Matt Rosno. With me again today is Josefina Mencia. We're live from Austin, Texas, here with the Austin branch of Fed at IBM. Woot woot. That would be front-end development at IBM, to be clear. And I'll tell you, we're feeling pretty good today compared to last week. To compare last week to today, we're not coming off a holiday weekend, which is great. So we're prepared. We didn't just put together the coming soon, we'll be live 30 seconds before we broadcasted like last time, so that's great. And we have more than one webcam, so we are off to a much better start. So some quick logistics before we get going here. This is recorded. It's through YouTube Live. If you need the recording, you're viewing it, just hit refresh and it's the same YouTube video. So we're keeping it simple there. We also have chat enabled to the right, and we'll hang out after this session to answer any questions that you have. Go ahead and ask those in chat. We also have the Carbon tutorial Slack channel. So this is the Developer Essentials series, and it's all about the Carbon design system. Our goal here is to advance front-end development throughout IBM, but then also beyond our walls as well. And so in doing so, we're putting together this tutorial that's part of the Carbon design system that goes hand in hand with Developer Essentials. And so we're going to keep that tutorial updated over time. And so if you have any questions as you work through this in Slack, we have the Carbon tutorial branch up and going. And on that note, thank you for everybody who completed step one. It's really great seeing so much activity on Slack and seeing people help each other in this communal learning was really a really great thing to experience. So thank you for helping others on Slack. Continue to ask those questions through the Slack channel, and we will help you out because really we're coming at this from many different levels of experience and backgrounds here. So let's keep that going in Slack. Before we get going, I want to unpack a little bit about what we did last week, because we could have very well, just copied and pasted and gone through the step one of the tutorial and submitted your PR, and that's great. But if you didn't get a chance to dig into what was happening under the hood a little bit, I highly recommend that. So just going through a few questions that came up throughout the last week. I guess first what I'm sharing here for this week, we have number 2, building pages up on carbondesignsystem.com. But if you're starting fresh with step 2, or you just kind of glazed over at the beginning of step 1, here in the overview, we have some prereq material. So if you're new to React, we have some links to some React tutorials and step-by-step guides that we like. Same goes with modern JavaScript syntax. If you're new to GitHub, GitHub has really good getting started documentation. And then also there were some questions around Yarn, and so there's some good links there that give some background behind Yarn and when you would use Yarn compared to something else. So first things first, we did a lot in step 1. It seemed pretty simple. Installing Carbon, customizing your SaaS build, importing the UI shell components, dropping those on the page, hooking up React Router. But in reality, we were doing a lot there, and we used Create React App, which is a boilerplate created by Facebook, to bootstrap this application that we started with. And it would be really good just to look under the hood and see everything that's doing. So it was easy for us to spin that up and build on top of it. But if you're doing this in more of a real life product application, you may want to customize it a little bit to some degree. So here, if you go to github.com/Facebook/create React app, this does a really good job of explaining everything that's provided here, as far as, hey, we just installed this one thing and we built on top of it, but it uses Webpack for tooling, it uses Babel to transpile JavaScript to something that modern, everyday browsers can understand. linting to make sure everything's consistent. We didn't really touch any of the configuration, but you can eject it at any point in time to see those details, and like how Webpack is being built, the bundling, the auto prefixing of CSS, all of that. So this is a really good resource for that. And then also, if you want to check out this guide right here, I'll open this up in a new tab. This is a closer look at Create React App, just the philosophy behind it, and then those commands that you were doing, like yarn start. It goes into some detail here on what that's doing behind the scenes. Next up, we ran into some issues with Netlify. So we use Netlify to do deploy previews. So once you submit your PR, it builds that within the Netlify environment, and then through GitHub hooks, it posts that preview link back to your pull request so that other people can see it and review it and whatnot. And since we are open source, since the tutorial is open source, we use the free plan for Netlify. And I think we were just running into some issues where we were hitting Netlify with so many PRs that it just couldn't exactly keep up. And so if you submit a PR and you don't get that green check because something happened with Netlify, my understanding, the best way to fix that is just to push a new commit. So you could touch a file, modify a comment, whatever, commit it, push it, and then that will trigger a new Netlify build, which will hopefully run this time. So I don't know, it may have been about 5% of the PRs ran into this. So that'd be one thing to look out for. And if anybody is an expert on Netlify and how we could fix that, please let me know. Because that's one area, like we want to give everybody those green check marks, right, when they submit their pull requests. The next thing, Artifactory, was an issue we ran into. Now in every starting branch of Carbon tutorial, we added the .npm RC file to configure the registry for NPM. So if you're using Artifactory for your IBM work, that's great. When you're working on the Carbon tutorial, this config file will get used, and that sets the registry to the public registry. So hopefully that smooths up some of that stuff as well. One other thing to note, if you go to w3.ibm.com/design/essentials, that's what we're doing now. You can see here in this first link, there's the Fed at IBM Branch link, and I'll just go ahead and open that. We have 10 or so labs who are doing the Carbon tutorial steps together in person. There's food, it's great, it's a lot of fun. If you are not involved in any of your local branches yet, now is a good opportunity to do so. Here I'll just scroll through this really quickly. So here are the first 5 local branches and when they meet per their local time zones, and there's also links to register that through Your Learning. And then also there are the bottom 5. And then also questions came up on badging and how we're recording completion of all of this. So we're in the intro session right now. You can manually mark completion through ENC. What's ENC stand for?
Events and classes.
Events and classes through Your Learning. Or if you clicked on the link and entered through to YouTube through that, it'll automatically register your attendance. As far as the tutorial steps go, if you're working on these in one of these cities, one thing that I think would help us review these is, here's a good example here, I'll highlight it. As you submit your PR, if you could include your city name in your commit message, that would help your local Fed at IBM branch leader find your PR. And then just a reminder, we're not merging these back in, because if we merge them in, that breaks the starting point for the next person who does the tutorial. So instead, it's a matter of reviewing it for accuracy and what the tutorial is accomplishing, but then us also internally tracking completion of the tutorial step for badging purposes. So I just want to give a shout out to everybody. You know, we have well over 200 completions of step 1, and I think that's really incredible. That's going from, you know, using GitHub and installing everything and installing Carbon, building out the step one and submitting the PR. I think that's a really big accomplishment for everybody, so that's great. So if your PRs have not been reviewed and closed yet, we'll get to those. We just wanted to make sure that every local branch leader has the opportunity to close their city's PRs before we go through the rest of them. I think one other thing I wanted to show off here, if you completed step one, that's awesome. We thank you. As you start step two, make sure that you check out the starting branch for step two, because we've included the assets that you need to complete step two. For example, step two has an image. So the starting branch for step two includes that image. So you're just locked and loaded and ready to go. And one other reason why you want to start with the actual branch instead of just continuing forward, if there are any styling fixes or things that we want to put in place that maybe have not been fixed upstream yet. So for example, here in index.scss, we wanted to modify how we use the grid because we're going to provide this new declaration block in the future. We haven't done that in Carbon yet, so we're just doing that here in the tutorial so you can use that class name and build how we need to build. So again, we're going to keep our live stream open at the very end for questions that come up. So we will be monitoring chat. But now let's take a quick look into this week's material and what we're going to be doing with part two.
Cool. So in part two, we're essentially going to be building our 2 pages with the grid, and we'll walk you through importing your dependencies for the grid. But one thing to note is you're still going to be starting the same way that you ended last week. So your pages should look pretty much blank. You'll have landing page, and then if you click on repositories, it'll be a repo page. And so that's what our apps looks like starting on step 2. And once we import our grid dependencies, we're going to add necessary classes and markup for the grid. And this is just an example of our grid. So you can see how we use, if you expand the code, you can see how we use different classes like bxgrid, bxrow, column to create columns. And this example actually shows some things that we'll be using. For example, offset classes. This is something that will pretty much allow you to have one column, but will allow you to offset it by a certain width. And so you can see here in the first column, it offsets 15 columns. And this is still just one column, but there's a huge offset. And so that's something that we'll mention in the tutorial and something that we'll actually get to implement. And you'll be able to see how we use that. This demo also goes into detail on how to use condensed examples of the grid, grid with no gutters if that's something that you're using in the future, and whatnot. So in step 2, you can see that we've now included some screenshots for you of the sketch file. And you can see that we actually have the grid on the sketch file. Even though it doesn't specifically say what classes you're going to be using, you can really deduce from the way things are aligned. So for example, you can see that this second row kind of has 2 columns. Things are kind of split up into 2 columns. And so by utilizing the sketch file and our grid demo, we're able to really see what classes we need to use for that. And of course, we'll have the code for you to just be able to copy and paste or type in yourself. But this is really there just so that you can actually understand how and why we're using the specific classes that we're using. And further down, we have some more screenshots of other sketch file things that will help you understand some of our tokens. So for example, this sketch screenshot shows some of the spacing that we're going to implement. And so if you actually go to our website, you can find our spacing guidelines, and this will show you all the different spacing tokens that we have. And so we use these along with Sketch to really just determine what the amount of space we need, and then use the tokens for that. And so if we go back to our instructions, you can see that for this particular example, we use spacing 05 right here, and then we use spacing 07 times 4. So that would be the 32 pixels 4 times, because we don't have a token for that amount, but we can easily use tokens to do something like that. And so that's how you would kind of determine how to use tokens based on what you have on Sketch. And you can see that we have like some negative tokens here, negative spacing 05, and so it can really be used anyway. And then further down we have another screenshot of something you might see in Sketch. So if we clicked on the text for design and build with Carbon, you can see here at the bottom where it says appearance, there is something that says heading 05. And so that has to do with one of our type tokens. And you can also find that on our website if you go to guidelines typography, and then you'll find them in productive. So this shows our examples. If you ever are wondering what our type tokens look like, this will show you not just like what they actually look like, but what actually goes into the code for that. And you'll see that we actually implement that type with one of our mixins right here, including Carbon type style. And then even though the sketch file just says heading 05, the token is actually productive heading 05 because we have productive and expressive type tokens. But for this tutorial, we'll only be using the productive type tokens. So this is just showing you how like you can determine which type token to use just by looking at the sketch file. And if there's ever not, like you're ever not sure exactly what the token is, again, you can also just like expand the appearance and it'll show you like the exact line height of the type, the font size, and the weight. And you can just kind of determine based on what each token has here. So the rest of this pretty much just also shows some more layout and type and spacing tokens that we use. You can see here that we're using a layout token, and that would be this blue margin that you see on Sketch. And the rest would be spacing tokens. So again, you can see how we're implementing spacing from Sketch and then using tokens for that. And then we have one more type token that we use there. So once we do start implementing the grid, your app should look something like this. It'll be kind of weird because we have 3 rows and we haven't added any styles to it. But if you inspect it, you should be able to see that you have 1 row, a 2nd row, and then a 3rd row. And by expanding it, we can see the actual columns in it. The first row only has 1 column that spans the full width of the row. And then the 2nd row has 2 columns, and this is where we'll be using one of the offset classes. Just because in the sketch file, it looks like the left column is just slightly smaller than the right column. So we have 1 column that spans 7/16 of the page, and then we have one that spans 8/16, but there's an offset class that you can see right there. And then if we inspect the last row, we'll see that there are 4 columns in the row. And so this is just implementing the grid, and then we'll start adding our components and styles for our components. And so the components that we'll be using, if you haven't used our React components before, you can actually find them in our storybook. And we'll be using DataTable. And so here's an example of DataTable. You can view the story, and that pretty much will show you some of the code that we use for that component. And you can also click on Show Info to see what that code would look like and what props that component would accept. So we'll be using DataTable with expansion. And again, you can expand that to view some more details if you haven't used this component before. We'll also be using tabs, so we can inspect that and view the story to see how we use this code. And one thing to note is that sometimes our components on Storybook include props that are a bit different than how we actually need to implement them. And that's just because of Storybook. It's only done for Storybook. So for example, right here we have props.tabs, and it's actually a function. This is just specifically for Storybook. If we view how it's implemented here, the props variable has a tabs function. That's not needed whenever you're not using Storybook. It doesn't have to be a function. So that's just one thing to note. The way that you might be able to tell if something is specifically for Storybook or not is just by looking at the show more info. You can see the prop types, and it'll tell you what specific kind of prop it'll be. So unless it says function, then you'll know this doesn't need to be a function. And we'll show you that example in the code here too. You'll notice the difference of how it needs to be just by inspecting the code. So you'll see that we have just props.tab, and that's different than the function. Another thing to know is just that once you're done with all the styles and adding the components, your styles for landing page should look something like this. So you can see that we've pretty much used spacing and type tokens for all of it. The one exception would be when we add some spacing for the tabs. We don't have a token that's specifically for -40 pixels, so we use one of our mixins that will convert the pixels to rem. But other than that, we're pretty much just using all of our carbon tokens. And so by the end of the tutorial, your app should look something like this, which implements some of our components, our tokens, and our grid, and very little override for styles.
Oh yeah, thanks for sharing. Can you scroll to the very top?
Yeah.
So yeah, this tutorial step is very heavy in building out this landing page, this initial page. Within the repositories page, it's pretty much a copy-paste exercise to get the initial data table in there. And that's because step 3 next week, we're going to be building some more functionality into that and hooking up the GitHub API to populate that table with dynamic data. So the focus of this tutorial step is static styling and getting the 2 pages built out. But if you're just questioning, why so much of this has an emphasis on this first page, that's why. I'm trying to think, what else do we want to cover here? Questions from the chat. So there are questions on Sketch. Sketch is a design tool used by many design teams. Scott, I know you're listening. Could you post any follow-up information in the Carbon tutorial branch on Sketch?
Already done.
It's already done?
Already there.
Awesome. That's good. Another question that I saw was on the grid. Does this use the CSS grid, or is it Flexbox focused? And our grid, it's Flexbox, and it's built in a way very similar to Bootstrap's grid in terms of you define the grid, and then you define rows, and then inside the rows you define columns. And my experience using it, you want to make sure that you stay true to that grid, row, column structure, because since we use Flexbox, if your component isn't used to being in a display flex container, things could get off. So if you skip the step where you go grid, row, your component, you may run into issues. So when it comes to the grid, a good example of this is we're using a grid for the entire page, but then once you look at the tab content inside the About tab, everything lines up to that same grid, but it's technically built as a nested grid. And so in doing that nested grid, we just had to make sure that we still did, the grid, the row, the column, DOM structure to get everything to lay out. Any questions here in the room?
There was a question on this chat around, can you use Carbon without the grid and use CSS grid instead?
You can, absolutely. I will tell you that by using the Carbon grid, it's set up with its gutters and its breakpoints and its column widths to match the design language specs. So to each their own. Use the best tool for what you're building, but just keep in mind that you may have to rebuild some of that yourself just to align up with the design language.
And then Alex asks, what if you need 3 columns in your page?
Ooh, that's a very good question. So by default, our grid is a 12-column grid, and that's for migration purposes because of the previous version, V9. So in this tutorial step, one of the first things that we do is we modify a feature flag to customize our grid to be a 16-pixel grid. So Josefina, do you want to just maybe open up Inspector and let's change this 50-50 to 3 columns there. So we'll do this live. Or actually, do you want to go to the very bottom of the page?
Okay.
That's a better example. So if we inspect this, we can see the class names are bx -- that's our prefix to prevent CSS class name collisions. And then here you see it says call - MD for medium -4, and then also call - column - large -4. So if we wanted to do, it's 3 columns instead of 4, we can modify this. All right, so now, ooh, that's a really good point. What's 16 divided by 3? That does not add up. Designers in the room.
I don't have any of those.
How do we handle a 3 column? I see what you're saying now.
Yeah.
Let me get back to you.
Actually, I think they talked about this a little bit in the Designer Essentials series.
Mm-hmm.
So I would refer anyone with those questions to go back and look at w3.ibm.com/design/essentials. We still have all of the Design Essentials series sessions available for your watching. So, and then you can always reach out to the design language team. How can they do that?
I would just use the Carbon -design -system Slack channel. That's just the
Yeah.
general purpose design and development, regardless of what you're building in.
One solution that we've used previously is to take the 4th column and split it into 2 and use that on as a bleed on both sides.
Yeah.
So that's and you can also so that's one way to go.
Yeah, it said here in the room, and that's similar to one of the comments here,
Probably didn't hear
is adding an offset. So
I was thinking that too.
so yeah. Awesome. What other questions do we have? Anything else here in the room?
We'll have to chat about the columns.
Ooh, Eric, thank you. For the 3 columns, you can just add bx - call 3 times, and it'll create the proper column breaks for you. So, yeah, good. Thanks for saying that. So by default, if you don't specify the number of columns, I'm pretty sure that has flex grow to be 1. So it's just going to fill the space of its container. So yeah, do bx call. Boom. There we go. Thank you team,
There you go.
for helping us answer that one. That, my friends, is how you do 3 columns in a 16-column grid.
And in global team programming.
Yes.
As opposed to pair programming.
No paragraph. Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining. We will just keep the live stream open for the next 5 minutes. in case you have follow-up questions. But a reminder, we will be live next week.